Continuing with the World and Thorinn by Damon Knight. Chapter 7, Section 3. The demons lifted Thorinn and propped him carelessly against a wall. His head and feet touched the wall, but his knees hung clear of the floor, and he realized that beside the stick under his arms, there was yet another crosswise to it. It occurred to him that the first time that his pack was gone, and the box with it. Whether his wallet and sword were there, he could not tell. Such light as there was came from dimly luminous patches on the walls and floor, as if sky moss had been rubbed there. In the gloom, the demons came and went. The chamber was immensely tall. Although his open eye was uppermost, Thorinn could not see the top. The demons went up and down with great swiftness, using cords that hung from the upper part of the chamber and poles that stood across it. In going up, they sometimes leaped from one pole to the next, but most often climbed the cords so lightly that they hardly seemed to touch. In coming down, they used the poles, leaping head downward from one to another until they reached the last, when they swung around and dropped to the floor. None came near Thorinn. He tried to break or loosen the cords around his wrists without success. Then he thought that if he could work his way upward along the one stick, the other stick, being attached to the first, would move downward along his back, and he might get some freedom for his arms. But although he was able to grip the stick between his thighs, he could not move his legs enough to accomplish anything. After a time, there was a stir above, and a swarm of demons dropped into view. 3 of them were females, as large as Thorinn, a head or more taller than the other demons, and he realized dimly that the others must be their young. The females crowded close around him, muttering and grunting. They took turns fingering his garments, tugging at his belt, prodding him. Their eyes were big and green. 2 or 3 of the small demons dived down the hole in the floor, followed after a moment by the rest. 2 of the big females turned, sprang up, and were lost to view in the gloom. The third went across the chamber and, hanging by one hand from some protuberance, took something out of the sack there and began to eat it. The strain on Thorinn's shoulders and hips grew painful. He tried to ease it by flexing his body, but his legs were drawn back so tightly that he could hardly move. The female demon finished whatever she was eating and took another piece. Thorinn found that he could push outward with his feet against the wall. It meant pulling his arms even tighter against the stick, but anything was better than lying still. And he did it again and again, rocking further out each time, until he overbalanced and fell on his face. Now he was entirely helpless. The most he could do was rock from side to side a little. The muscles of his legs and buttocks began to cramp. After a long time, the demon came back and lifted him by the stick, propping him against the wall again. She had something round in her hand. She took a bite of it, and bright juice ran down her chin. She held the thing out. Its pungent smell made Thorinn swallow. He opened his dry mouth. Quickly, with her other hand, she thrust a wad of dirt and trash into his mouth. Thorinn spat it out, dry leaves, filth, and spat, spat, spat. Across the room, the demon was grunting in a slow rhythm, and he realized at length that the creature was laughing. More time passed. The demon left off eating and picked up a half-finished mat from the floor. She began working at it, holding it with her feet while she braided the long strips together. Thorinn remembered the sound of the river purling down endlessly against the stones, dropping away, spurting, trickling, falling in sheets below. Cool and clean, clean and cool. He saw the demon put her work away and get up. The wall shook. Then small demons were erupting into the room, dozens of them, followed after a moment by bigger ones, bigger even than the females. The room was full of them. They were hanging from the walls and the climbing poles. They were all around him. They jerked him away from the wall and stood him up on his stick, crossing and crowding close. turning him this way and that, rumbling and grunting to each other. They were a head taller than Thornton, wider but thinner than the females. Their spindly arms were stronger than they looked. One of them tugged impatiently at Thornton's belt, then fumbled with the buckle until he got it open and dragged off the belt, which another immediately snatched away from him. A third pulled down Thornton's breeks. A fourth yanked his head back, pulled his jaw open, and stared into his mouth. The uproar was stunning. All the males grunting at once, the children and females leaping back and forth overhead, and Thornton shoved this way and that until his head spun. He felt a sharp tug at his wrists, then a slackening. His legs were released, and a moment later one of the males was pulling off his breeks and holding them up for the others to see. Thornton's feet trailed on the floor like dead things. It was only the stick in the demon's hands that held him upright. After a moment he felt someone working at his wrists too. Then they were released, the cross sticks pulled away, and he began to fall. But the demons hauled him upright again and tugged his shirt off over his head. Someone held him up by the hair, while the rest examined him minutely, feeling his skin, pressing muscles, poking fingers into ribs. Thornton could do nothing to prevent this. He could move his arms a little, but not his legs, and his hands felt like lumps of meat. At some point, they had got his shoes off too, and were passing them around. Thornton saw one huge male holding up the belt and pointing to it, his mouth opening and closing. In the general din, he could not hear anything, but others could. They crowded toward the demon with the belt, then dispersed again, and the commotion spread. A knot of struggling figures formed halfway up the wall, broke and dropped to the floor. Other demons crowded in, wedging Thornton tighter, but those approaching him from the rear forced their way through. In the midst of these were two demon children, gripped by their hair and squalling. One of the old demons barked at them, pointing to Thornton, and then to the belt, which he shook in their faces. Thornton could see that he was pointing first to one place on the belt, then another, and guessed that they were worn places where his wallet and sword had hung. The children answered. The old demon cuffed them. The children disappeared into the crowd, followed by some of the adults. And that's the end of section 3.